All right, everyone. Hi. So let's finish up with Foucault. Um, we just finished chapter 8, and we're beginning with the birth of the asylum. And the birth of the asylum, this is the final chapter, the conclusion. This is also going to be the foundation for Foucault's next book, which is called The Birth of the Clinic. So this chapter's got a lot of sort of historical. There's a lot of there's a lot to cover here. Obviously, Foucault writes in their whole book about it. Um, but what's happening in this chapter is a description of the transformation from confinement to the asylum, and with that, the transformation of the treatment of madness from physical constraint to non-physical control, from chains to conscience. So the story that he's essentially telling here is the story of two early psychiatrists, Tuke and Pinel. And the story of Tuke and Pinel is the story of liberation of madness that I mentioned in the last video. This moment where the mad are released from confinement and are sort of allowed back into society in some form. And so by telling the story of Pinel and Tuke, not sure if I'm pronouncing those names correctly, what Foucault is also doing is setting up a story about Freud and psychoanalysis. And that's really the story that I want to focus on or go into some depth with, given our reading of Civilization and its Discontents. But so in this liberation of madness by Pinel and Tuke, we get two different sort of stories about how the mad are brought back into society to some extent. So what we begin with the story of Tuke. Let me, I had this all pulled up. That's William Tuke, the English tradesman, philanthropist, and Quaker. That's coming from Wikipedia, but right, we get a lot about William Tuke's religion here, Quakerism. And William Tuke begins this asylum that is a kind of, well, it's the model for a number of sort of penal colonies. I mean, it's not strictly speaking a penal colony, but it's a kind of colony, the sort of asylum that we think of when we think of insane asylums now, right? A place dedicated just to the mad that's out of society, but which accepts visitors and has some sort of community unto itself, right? And it's about finding that community, developing that community that's really important. So this colony, this community is called The Retreat, which is started by Tuke, and this is one of those asylums that is separated from prisons for the first time, right? Where the asylum is separated from prison, and where the mad are treated differently from the criminal because they are given psychiatric treatment, right? So Tuke is a psychiatrist, but his method of treatment is going to not be, as Foucault repeats, right, not going to be medical, but instead moral, right? Tuke offers a kind of moral treatment to madness. the retreat was a kind of religious community, um, Quaker community. Mhm. Uh, so here we get this in the example of the retreat. Um, a new kind of it's not a medical, right? This is what Foucault is really wants to hammer home. It's not medical treatment. It continues to understand madness as uh, as essentially a religious problem, as an affliction of the soul. So the beginnings of the asylum of medical treatment of madness are religious. Uh, he says at 224, uh, there, at the retreat, the religious and moral milieu was imposed from without in such a way that madness was controlled, not cured. Right? What the goal was to control, not to cure. And that's true for both Tuke and Pinel, and I think Foucault wants to suggest, by extension, this is true also of Freud, right? That what is being offered through psychoanalysis and these earlier forms of psychiatry is not actually a cure for madness, not anything that right heals the brain. We'd say if madness is then considered mental illness, well, you'd expect from a cure uh, to have that illness eradicated. But that is not the goal here, and maybe isn't continuing forward. But certainly at the retreat, right, the goal is not, or what is offered is not a cure, but the means of controlling madness. And the way that this control is exerted is through religion and moral instruction. Right? uh, Now, the sort of breakthrough is in recognizing the madness, the reason in madness, right? Uh, at the retreat, religion was part of the movement which indicated, in spite of everything, the presence of reason in madness. Right? So, uh, in being sympathetic to the mad, in bringing them into this retreat, they were then treated. Uh, they were taught to control themselves. They were controlled, the mad were, through persuasion, in a certain sense, through reason, right? It treats the mad as, if not rational agents, uh, as having the capacity for reason, being susceptible to persuasion. And that is the essential difference, the breakthrough, right? So he says on 246, right? Here, fear is addressed to the invalid directly, not by instruments, but in speech. There is no question of limiting a liberty that rages beyond its bounds, but of marking out and glorifying a region of simple responsibility, where any manifestation of madness will be linked to punishment. Right? So rather than chaining people up, right, no question of limiting a liberty that rages beyond its bounds, uh, but instead of marking out and glorifying a region of simple responsibility that can be found in the map, right? That sort of glimmer of reason that remains in madness, the reason of the mad, can be spoken to, it can be appealed to. And in madness, this simple responsibility can be sort of brought out of a person. And once that capacity for responsibility is brought out, then the madness of that same person will be linked by the doctor to guilt, to shame, right? And this occurs not by instruments of fear, but through speech. Right? So the method of control, the method of confinement is not physical, but verbal. And right, the means of control is in appealing to this simple responsibility that the mad person feels. The obscure guilt that once linked transgression and unreason is thus shifted. The madman, as a human being originally endowed with reason, is no longer guilty of being mad. But the madman, as madman, and in the interior of that disease of which he is no longer guilty, must feel morally responsible for everything within him that may disturb morality and society, and must hold no one but himself responsible for the punishment he receives. In other words, the method of sort of containment, the control that's exerted here, is this moral control that taps into the reason of the mad, the sense of responsibility that still exists in the mad, and then teaches them, the mad, to link their madness, those moments that are deemed to be mad, to guilt. Right? In other words, what these asylums do, according to Foucault, is teach the mad to be ashamed of their madness. And we remember, I said, in confinement, although they were physical chains, they were physically constrained, the mad were free to be mad. Their madness was not manipulated. Here, we get the opposite, right? They are not chained. They're free to have, free movement. But the sort of course of madness, the freedom of their minds, however mad they might be, is manipulated. It's manipulated through speech, through appeals to this responsibility, and the attempt is not to control the bodies of the mad, but instead an attempt to control madness itself. Now, I think the bigger idea here is going to be, just as confinement sought to make madness invisible, this moral control is also not going to, again, cure madness, but make madness invisible, make madness not seen. Right? What you should feel guilty for as a mad person is not being mad. There's no guilt in being mad. You're not responsible for your madness. But you must feel morally responsible for everything within that madness that may disturb morality and society. Right? So you have to be responsible for yourself with respect to society. So again, a very an ideology befitting of the individualism of liberal democracies. So he goes on. The point of this, the way this works as control to make madness no longer visible, to continue it being confined within the mad person's mind. That's what control of the mad will ultimately seek, to, within the mad, confine the madness to the inner world, to inner life, not let madness out into the external world, where it would disturb morality and society. I'm on page 246 to 247 here. So he goes on. Right? The assignation of guilt is no longer the mode of relation that obtains between the madman and the sane man in their generality. It becomes both the concrete form of coexistence of each madman with his keeper. Here's the important part. And the form of awareness the madman must have of his own madness. Okay, so the assignation of guilt is no longer the relation between madman and sane man, meaning the sane man accuses the madman of being guilty of madness. Instead, the assignation of guilt becomes the concrete form, coexistence of the madman with his keeper. The madman is now, right, guilt is assigned not by the sane person, but by the keeper, the psychiatrist. But here's again, the most important part. The assignation of guilt is now in the form of awareness that the madman must have of his own madness. The madman must become aware of his own madness through the assignation of guilt, by assigning guilt to himself, by learning to feel guilt. The madman must become aware of his madness, and vice versa. By becoming aware of his madness, he must learn to feel guilt. So, again, a couple of connections to Freud and psychoanalysis here. First of all, the fact that this is achieved through speech foreshadows psychoanalysis, which Freud called the talking cure. And so it is treatment through speech, setting up Freud and psychoanalysis. And also, that the key is having the mad person become aware of their own madness. That is the key to controlling madness. Once the mad person is aware of their madness and what the keeper or psychiatrist deems mad, then they're taught to feel guilt about that and to not let those behaviors, those mad behaviors, out into society. So all this, obviously, has a lot to do with Freud, has a lot to do with social control, right? The idea of the superego. I think it's especially interesting with respect to Civilization and its Discontents to think about that ambivalence that Freud has about sort of the ultimate source of the superego. Is it society itself, or is it the father? And what's really the difference, right, between the father and society itself? We'll talk about that much more in a minute. But I think what we have to conclude from Civilization and its Discontents is that the ultimate source of the superego is not an individual's father, but society in general. And so the superego then becomes nothing more than a set of social norms. And what the superego then does is restrict, control those impulses which go against the norms of a society, which are deemed mad. And so the keeper here, the psychiatrist, is playing the role of superego, and as we'll see in a moment, explicitly playing the role of the father. But in any case, we see all these sort of Freudian themes already in play here. This theme of control, of preventing certain behaviors from spilling over into society. That is, we can understand all of Freud in that way also, all those aspects of our psyche which belong to unreason, which are the id, right, need to be controlled. And they're controlled precisely by our feeling of guilt for disturbing social norms. So he says, continuing on 247 here, We must therefore reevaluate the meanings assigned to Tuke's work. Liberation of the insane, abolition of constraint, constitution of a human milieu. These are only justifications. The real operations were different. In fact, Tuke created an asylum where he substituted for the free terror of madness the stifling anguish of responsibility. Right? The new form of control is simply social responsibility. And so here we see this direct connection back to Freud and the thought that society is controlling us, right? The manner in which society controls us through our superego, through the imposition of norms, of ideals, which are then internalized as our own conscience. What is more controlling than your conscience? And that is, in essence, what is being given to the matter. That's the thought, right? We need to develop a conscience within the mad. So, here already, I think we see the theme of freedom coming back in a major way. What were the mad in the Renaissance? They were the free. What were the mad even in the classical period? The free, in the sense that they're free from work, free from responsibility, the responsibilities of office, of state, free of responsibility, that is. So madness starts to seem like freedom from responsibility. And that takes us back again also to the disorder of the passions that is part of madness, right? The failure to have the appropriate emotional responses to things, right? So to be, unrepentant, to not feel guilt, for example, for doing something that hurts somebody else is kind of madness, but it's also a kind of freedom from social responsibility, from that feeling of being responsible for your actions. Not freedom in a good sense or necessarily a bad sense, but simply freedom as freedom from responsibility in both its good and bad senses. And so the kind of control then that's being exerted is the control of responsibility, the same kind of control that's exerted over all of us, right? It's trying to make the mad into normal people, in functioning citizens, to the extent that they can be. In other words, it is applying the power of the superego to the mad, right? The idea being that is what they lack. Now, this was accomplished through a number of ways. First, it was accomplished through work. The mad were socialized by giving them jobs, right, being put to work. Through work, man returns to the order of God's commandments. He submits his liberty to laws that are those of both morality and reality. And so work will be the manner that they become socialized, that they learn responsibility and thus guilt. And we can think again also, right, this is going back to an original idea about madness. The mad are the idle, those who don't work. And we can also think about what Foucault is saying about work being an imperative of, again, liberal democracies. In order to be a person, you have to work. But, he says, another key way was to actually have sort of social gatherings for the mad to attend. The directors and staff of the retreat thus regularly invited several patients to tea parties. The guests dress in their best clothes and vie with each other in politeness and propriety. And so, at the insane asylum, they would throw tea parties, not just for the mad, but for everyone, for their friends, for regular society, and the mad would then, right, have to sort of perform, and they would see other their peers, right, other people from the asylum behaving madly. They would see the way other people treated other mad people. Uh, so they would learn sort of because their doctors were observing them. This was an exercise. This wasn't for fun. Uh, the doctors were sort of teaching them how to appear normal, right? And that was really the key, the appearance of normalcy. So at these tea parties, Foucault writes, incessantly cast in this empty role of unknown visitor and challenged in everything that can be known about him, drawn to the surface of himself by a social personality silently imposed by observation, by form and mask, the madman is obliged to objectify himself in the eyes of reason as the perfect stranger, that is, as the man whose strangeness does not reveal itself. So at these tea parties, the madman is obliged to objectify himself in the eyes of reason, forced to see himself through other people's eyes, and to thus, right, perfect the role of someone whose strangeness does not reveal itself. Okay, so on the one hand, certainly we want to say this is humanitarian. Foucault is arguing that this is still, control, manipulation, and nefarious in that sense. There's something nefarious happening. Maybe nefarious is too strong a word, but certainly what is happening in asylums is not liberation, but a different form of control. So we'd want to say, of course, this form of control seems more humanitarian, is more humanitarian, and I think we are tempted to say there's nothing wrong here, right? This seems good. This is what's wrong with being objectified through someone else's eyes, in the eyes of reason, right? Isn't this how everyone goes about their lives, right? And I think that's kind of the point, right? Or that's interesting. We say that kind of responsibility, the responsibility to conceal one's strangeness for the sake of being polite, is a good thing, right? Is no small price to pay in order to some extent, be able to participate in society. Certainly, and I think the other thing we might say is, in the same way that society and the responsibilities of society, the expectations of society, can be oppressive, can themselves lead to certain kinds of madness, as we saw in the Freud book, then madness is this sort of delightful escape from that. Yes, painful in many ways. But again, we have to always think, this is what we were talking about in the live meeting the other week. Is madness painful? Is madness disturbing because of the madness itself, or because of the social response to madness? Even schizophrenia, right? Is schizophrenia itself painful, or is it only painful when one recognizes that one is thus alienated from society, that one is not normal, not living up to the norms. So I think it is conceivable that we could think of madness as a kind of freedom from social restraints, social control, and that uh, by attempting to suppress madness even within the mad, right, to prevent madness from becoming visible even within the mad, the power of social control becomes that much more far-reaching and totalizing. Uh, I think going back to the first video I did on Foucault, I said Foucault is interested in thinking about the way modern institutions exert social control in these non-physical ideological ways. I think this is exactly what's happening here. Like that, what is what's happening when madness becomes a medical concern, when we get this kind of psychiatry and therapy, is that madness as a realm outside social responsibility becomes vanishingly small, only internal, and can never be allowed out on the streets. So from the moment we begin in the Renaissance, when the mad were, you know, uh, still roaming the streets, still before confinement, when the mad were sort of part of society, madness was a part of everyday life. Unreason was nothing to be worried about. As we progress through the quote unquote age of reason, through the Enlightenment, through scientific revolution, all of that, what happens is madness becomes more and more excluded, more and more denied and refused. And this is not about the triumph of reason, or if this is about the triumph of reason, then the triumph of reason, it would seem, is identical to the triumph of mass social control. And that sounds extremely conspiratorial. Uh, it's not right that this control is exerted by one person, a king, a president, or even a Congress. The control is, again, uh, a kind of effect of large historical transformations. Uh, no one decided that madness needed to be controlled in this way. There was no program beginning in 1500 that is accomplished in 1900. But rather, what we're seeing is, I think that's sort of why these books are so fascinating and bizarre and sort of difficult to read, is that what Foucault is showing is the way uh, that society transforms at a kind of granular level, uh, without any obvious engine for that change. What we see here through this history of madness is the history of the modern period, but without any of the major figures that you expect to hear from. Right? We don't hear from Martin Luther. We don't hear from. We hear just the smallest amount from Descartes. We don't hear from, sort of any major philosophers or politicians from the period. It is a study of policy, sort of, not terribly important policy in the sense that it doesn't transform the lives of the whole civilization. It only affects one small segment, the mad, although rather large segment when you recognize that the mad include the poor, the idle, the arrogant, at different stages in different ways in different cases. But right, this small sort of history also shows this sort of larger sweep of history, the way that the values of reason, individuality, responsibility, science, um, economic forces, the way all of these uh, leave their mark and are really the engine of that transforms this strange small history, this history of madness. Um, okay, so we see that at the retreat on 250, the partial suppression of physical constraint was part of a system whose essential element was the constitution of a self-restraint, in which the patient's freedom, engaged by work and the observation of others, was ceaselessly threatened by the recognition of guilt. Right? In place of physical constraints, we get self-restraint. And he continues, right? But the self-restraint is, again, about controlling what appears, not what is, but rather what one does. And another tangent. One other thing this sort of appeals to is the idea that behind our conscience, behind our socialization, there is this madness or something like madness in all of us that is from the beginning controlled. Right? Reason is brought out from madness. Madness is the sort of original state of human being. Right? Madness lies in language. Language gives itself easily to madness. Most language is madness, in the sense that most things we say have no scientific truth to them. All right. So, once this self-restraint has been instilled in the mad person, they become responsible for their behavior. But madness, he writes on 250, is responsible only for that part of itself which is visible. All the rest is reduced to silence. Madness no longer exists except as seen. So, right, again, the only part that matters is the part that's seen. Uh, as long as it's not visible, you can be as mad as you like. And so here, this will be our final, no, maybe not our final, but on the bottom of 250, we get this connection to Freud more explicitly from Foucault. Right? So he writes, the science of mental disease as it would develop in the asylum would always be only of the order of observation and classification. It would not be a dialogue. In other words, the science of mental disease, right, meant observing the mad and classifying kinds of madness. Right? We saw some classifications of madness in aspects of madness. It would not be a dialogue. In other words, right, you'd say, when you're at the cocktail party, did you notice that when you claimed to be King Louis XVI, everyone started acting weirdly and walked away from you? You should be ashamed of that. That is mad behavior. The reason why no one wants to talk to you is because that's crazy, and you have to stop. Right? Not a dialogue, right? But you verbally punish, verbally chastise. The dialogue doesn't happen until Freud, right? Where the mad are asked to speak, and what the mad say is thought to have meaning by Freud. So he continues. It could not be that until psychoanalysis. Oh, I'm sorry. It would not be a dialogue. It could not be until psychoanalysis had exercised this phenomenon of observation essential to the 19th century asylum and substituted for its silent magic the powers of language. It would be fair to say that psychoanalysis doubled the absolute observation of the watcher with the endless monologue of the person watched. So, what Freud does is, rather than observe behavior, listen. But in this, thus preserving the old asylum structure of non-reciprocal observation, but balancing it in a non-symmetrical reciprocity by the new structure of language without response. Right? This is the original psychoanalytic method. Analysand, the person being analyzed, lies on the couch and just talks, right? Talks and talks and talks until their unconscious starts to come out, and the analyst, just listens, right? So it's this non-reciprocal relation, right? Non-symmetrical reciprocity. Rather than just observing, with Freud, the analyst begins listening also. But, I think we would say, still with Freud, there is the judgment, right? And that judgment is a moral judgment. We are told, that is your id, that's your unconscious, that's an overactive superego. That desire is perverse. That desire has to be repressed. You're neurotic because something you did or something that happened to you. And I don't think Foucault is saying this, and I'm not saying this, that there isn't value in those Freudian observations, that Freudian technique, but to recognize that it is based primarily in morality and a moral judgment, and that for Freud and long after Freud, the psychoanalyst, man, I cannot speak right now. The psychoanalyst uh, you know, viewed themselves as an observer. You go in and you think of Woody Allen sort of going to the Woody Allen going to his psychoanalyst, and you know Woody Allen's a smart, capable person. God, why am I using Woody Allen as an example? Sorry, forgive me. Any smart person goes to the psychoanalyst, and no matter how capable they are, they're viewed by the psychoanalyst as a subject, and whatever they say is not a person talking to you, but is the manifestation already of a kind of madness that needs to be observed, understood, listened to, classified, and then treated. So the objectification of the patient, which the extreme objectification of confinement, obviously, where you're thrown into a dungeon and chained up, and then this more sort of humanitarian objectification of the asylum, where you're observed and you're corrected, through um, moral exhortation, and then finally uh, the the objectification within psychoanalysis, which objectifies your speech and analyzes not just your behavior, but your motives, what you say, what you think, and from there, right, makes a judgment about your your failures, right? Uh, and again, what that will be in making you aware of your madness, and the causes of your madness, resurfacing uh, the old neurotic connections, and their causes through psychoanalysis, bring them back up. All right, so we're out of time, but that is the essential idea here with the connection to Freud at the end. I think I just want to mention on page 254, it's very important. I'm sorry, 252, going through to 254, that uh, in the 19th century, in the 18th century, 1800s asylums, uh, he writes, the absence of constraint in the 19th century asylum is not unreason liberated, but madness long since mastered. For this new reason which reigns in the asylum, madness does not represent the absolute form of contradiction, but instead a minority status. Madness, he goes on, is childhood. Right? 252, page 252. So, all that in the asylum, the mad take on a different aspect, where they're no longer criminals. They're understood instead to be minors, in the sense of immature, like children. And, um, I think this obviously connects to the whole discussion about Freud, and, well, several things, right? First of all, the children, the mad are considered to be children, and therefore what they need. So the classical thinking, so the thinking of the asylum went, is a father figure. They need a father figure, and a father figure is going to exert that control over them, give them a conscience, teach them how to be in society. They need a strong father, and who fills that role? The keeper, the psychiatrist. And this very much continues through psychoanalysis, where Freud spends a long time talking about the way that the psychiatrist becomes this kind of authority figure, kind of father figure, and that is the way that therapy works, is to step in and provide this new father-like figure, to rejigger the conscience, to rejigger what you feel guilty about, and how you behave, how you react to your impulses, right? To sort of re-raise, re-father the mad. So there's this deeply paternalistic spirit in psychiatry and in psychoanalysis. But this obviously also connects to society and to the role of the father in the psyche and the superego, right? So, thinking about that Freud observation, right, that religion is a kind of search for a father figure. Um, and, if we say the religious are searching for a father, the mad are in need of a father. Uh, Psychoanalysis, psychiatry then um, appears to just be a kind of moral authority. And it imposes its values. It enforces the norms of the modern world. Right? This is what psychiatry is. And that's what Freud is talking about. We need stronger enforcement of the norms of modern society. That's the problem. And psychiatry is attempting to do that. And that's also what's happening in the asylum, right? The mad are outside of the norms. And this is a major problem for modernity. It's a problem in general. And what they need is for those norms to be enforced through a moral authority. And this is what the keepers, the psychiatrists, and the psychoanalysts of the 19th and 20th century became, these father figures. And they were able to resolve madness, to impose this self-restraint, to control the madness within people by becoming these father figures, essentially. A very non-medical, very non-scientific role. I mean, we could say, in a certain sense, that in the same way that the priests or the church enforced the norms of the era of monarchy, of the Renaissance and medieval ages, that the medical and in particular, the psychiatric institutions and establishments enforce the norms of the modern age, right? And so psychoanalysts become understand themselves. They have this sort of veneer of science, but what they really are these moral figures. I want to find where Freud says that. They did not introduce science, but a personality, whose powers borrowed from science only their disguise, and at most their justification. Right? That is what Foucault concludes psychiatry is. And continues on 272. The keeper of madmen who has obtained domination over them directs and rules their conduct as he pleases. He must be endowed with a firm character and on occasion display an imposing strength. He must threaten little but carry out his threats, and if he is disobeyed, punishment must immediately ensue. That's a quote from Tuke, I believe. Right? That is who a keeper must be. Firm character. Foucault then writes, the physician could exercise his absolute authority in the world of the asylum only insofar as, from the beginning, he was father and judge, family and law. He takes on the role of society itself. This is roughly what we see Freud attempting to do. All right, so I want to conclude there and just say one word about the conclusion, which is kind of a beautiful, it's interesting. Discussion of art, right? Madness and art and relation between madness and art. And I think what's interesting is we think of artists as being mad. He mentions Van Gogh famously goes mad, the philosopher Nietzsche, who goes mad, spends the last decade of his life in an insane asylum, and the Marquis de Sade, from whom we get the term sadism and sadistic, who spent much of his life in an insane asylum and in and out of prison for horrible sexual crimes. So it's interesting that he brings these people up, but in each of these, I think the only thing I really want to mention is that he says madness begins where the work of art ends. Where there is no work of art, there is madness. In other words, the artist is never mad. There's never madness in an artwork. Rather, madness only begins after there is no art, when there is no art to make. The idea being that madness is not madness when it's an art. Those artists who go mad because the art ends. And in saying that, right, there is no madness in the work of art, I think what Foucault is pointing to is this idea that we still have some small section of society in which unreason is allowed to operate. And that is within art, within the arts. And that in art, therefore, we get a sort of final place where we can step outside the social control of modernity, of liberal democracy, and where we can experience that freedom that belongs to madness. And in that freedom, evaluate our social norms and the expectations of society from outside them, right, in a new way. All right, so we ran late, but that's all for today.